It's often overlooked that Frederick Douglass became a national leader in the abolitionist movement right here in Massachusetts. Douglass escaped slavery in Maryland as Fred Bailey and traveled north to freedom through the Underground Railroad, passing through New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and finally landing in New Bedford. I spoke with the president of the New Bedford Historical Society and the British Consul General to New England about the incredible impact Frederick Douglass had on Massachusetts and in the UK. Lee Blake from the New Bedford Historical Society, the president, joining me now. It's so fascinating because Frederick Douglass was one of the most famous Americans, of course, of his century. And his story of arriving in New Bedford really opens up a whole chapter of his life here in New England. What year did he arrive in New Bedford? And working with abolitionists here in Massachusetts, what was that decade like for him?
Well, Frederick Douglass escapes from Maryland when he's 20 years old, and people often forget how young he was. He's 20 years old. He spent some time in Maryland, which is where he met his fiancée, Anna Douglass, and Frederick escapes by train to New York. He wears a sailor suit that his fiancée, Anna, has sewn for him, and black seamen was so ubiquitous in those times that people didn't even think about it. It says a black seaman in a suit sitting on a train coming to New York. That was normal, but that was his escape route to come to New York and then to be sent on to New Bedford, where he could then work as a whaler or an apprentice of some sort, working on the decks in New Bedford. And when you ask about what that decade was like, New Bedford was a hotbed of abolition, just like Boston was. New Bedford was very well known as the whaling capital of the time. So there was plenty of work for anybody who was interested in hard labor. At the time, we actually called it welcoming green hands, meaning anybody new to the industry could get a job on a whaling ship. So for someone who was a freedom seeker, a fugitive, the idea that you could get on a whaling ship, work, really learn a trade in some ways. Some of them people learned how to read on the whaling trip, but you could really recreate yourself while you were at sea.
And New Bedford also had a thriving African-American community, is that right, at the time?
New Bedford had a thriving African-American community. At one point in time, in 1857, 16% of New Bedford were people of color, higher than the numbers in Boston, because of course our population was smaller. But 16%, they were Cape Verdeans, African Americans. There were also some Polynesians at the time, some Asians, but it was a very high number. And people in the whaling industry were very concerned about making sure that there was a protective environment for their workers. People did not come to New Bedford, and I should say slave hunters did not come to New Bedford to try to snatch people and take them back, because the whaling population, the whaling owners would not allow that.
Yeah, they were very protective of the community.
That's right.
Yeah, fascinating. And so as Frederick Douglass was allowed to prosper, write, lecture, did he work in the shipping industry as well, simultaneously?
Initially, Frederick picked up odd jobs. So for one of his first jobs is with the First Unitarian Church, and he's essentially shoveling coal for the church and doing odds and ends. He tried to get a job. Douglass was known as a skilled caulker, and a caulker is somebody who fills in the cracks on ships to make sure that they're safe in the water. So he was skilled in that. When he tried to get a job on the deck, I should say on the docks, initially, many of the workers would not work with him. But the whaling master said, if you don't work with Fred, if you don't work with him, you're not going to work on my ships. So that's another way that the whaling masters protected their workers, but also made sure that the docks were integrated.
Yeah, and that's power, right? They were very powerful. Right. This is what is fascinating to me. I want to bring Peter Abbott in, who is the British Consul General for New England. When people go to New Bedford and they understand at this, at the Historical Society, the museums there, that part of the history of Frederick Douglass is being able to go from New Bedford to Great Britain and Ireland. And this was common for abolitionists?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. At this period of time in history, a number of abolitionists and others who were working to abolish the slave trade in the United States were traveling to England, to Ireland, to Scotland to meet up with others, to go on lecture tours of the United Kingdom and try and increase support for their cause.
Because, of course, it's important to remember that the British had abolished slavery in 1833. Am I correct about that year?
So what happened is in England, we abolished the slave trade before we abolished slavery itself. You're absolutely right that it was around this period of time that the big abolitionist movement was sweeping through England, sweeping through the British Empire at the time. And it was the Royal Navy who was eventually charged with ending the slave trade in the British Empire. And then it was a few years later that we actually ended the practice of slavery itself.
And as I understand it from your recent tour there with Lee, Frederick Douglass actually thought about staying and living in the United Kingdom. Is that right? Because he was so well received there?
So he was very well received, and he wrote later that he was treated not as a colour but as a man when he was in England, and he found, I think, a very, very receptive audience to his messages. And he was particularly well received in the north of England. He stayed with a Quaker family called the Richardson family in Newcastle in the north of England, and it was Anna Richardson in that family who raised enough money for Frederick Douglass to buy his freedom, and it was when he was in England that he bought his freedom. And what's quite a nice modern connection is that the University of Newcastle just a couple of years ago named one of their new learning centres the Frederick Douglass Centre in recognition of the north of England's and Newcastle's connections to Frederick Douglass.
The English become very important in creating a national and an international voice against the slave trade. So people like Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, who's also from Cambridge, who lives in Cambridge but was a fugitive from Kentucky. He comes, William Wells Brown, Henry Box Brown. There are a whole number of Black abolitionists who come to these conventions along with William Lloyd Garrison, but they also have different philosophies about how abolition and how slavery should end.
Sure.
And that's one of the interesting things about working also with all of these different personalities in England.
So he found a forum there, but ultimately he knew he had to come back.
He does. His wife and 3 young children are in New Bedford, and he thinks about bringing them actually to live in England. But he recognizes that he's such an important voice and presence that he has to come back and really carry that voice to the population in the United States. He recognizes that moral suasion is one of the most important ways that he was nonviolent, but you had to be able to talk to people about why slavery was wrong, what it was doing to people, what it was doing to the spirit of the country, and also to look at, the founding principles of freedom in the United States and what did it mean if they had 4 million people who were enslaved.
Yeah. So, Peter, our histories are so inextricably linked in New England and in Great Britain. When you think about the legacy of an American like Frederick Douglass, sort of coming and lecturing at this crucial period of time, that's a beautiful story about the University in Newcastle naming a building. And do you think this relationship, it was a very important emblem of that particular decade itself?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important for all of us, both in the UK and here in the US, to remember Frederick Douglass and remember others like him who really led the most extraordinary lives at great personal cost and risk to themselves and their loved ones to speak out against slavery. And Frederick Douglass lived for a very long time. And in fact, after the period that we're talking about, where he was in England from 1845 to 1847, he traveled back to England twice, two more times in his lifetime, when he was quite elderly, to continue to make that case and push that case, because he knew that if Black and people of color were not free around the world, they would never really truly be free in the United States. So he really saw that kind of international angle to his work, which I think is really important still today.
And Lee, what's the last thought you want to leave with people if they come to New Bedford, if they want to understand the history of Frederick Douglass in this part of Massachusetts?
I'd certainly welcome them to visit the Nathan and Polly Johnson House, and that is the home where Frederick and Anna Douglass come initially in 1838 and live for several months. But the Nathan and Polly Johnson House was the home for a number of freedom seekers, including William Wells Brown, who I'd mentioned before, who's the first African-American novelist. His daughters lived there. There are a number of people who fathered children in the South who were a mixed parentage. Those children were often sent to New Bedford so they could be educated. People ended up in these relationships where they knew that their children were going to be slaves. So they figured out ways to circumnavigate that, either by coming to New Bedford or some of the towns in Massachusetts where education was integrated. And New Bedford had an integrated education system, which is astounding when you think about it. In 1950, we were still fighting that battle.
Right. Massachusetts students should certainly be brought to New Bedford to study this incredible part of American history and the life of Frederick Douglass. So Lee Blake and Peter Abbott from the British Consulate, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.